which regulates substances such as alcohol, cannabis, and any other controlled or slightly dangerous substances that you need permits for permission to release the area. Then before that used to be the legal counsel at the Ministry of Commerce, and prior to that he was in private practice. So without further ado, welcome to some more people.
Good evening, everyone. Not sure if this thing is good. Do I need the mic? Or can persons hear me without it? Not one who is too much of a fan of
Y'all can hear him?
Yes. Good evening, everyone. So I've been asked to give a brief address on life outside the courtroom. Back in 2006, for some reason, I decided to be an attorney. Carnival. That's right. So, somewhere back in 2006, I decided I wanted to become an attorney. I don't know why at the time, actually I do. To be honest, both of my parents were police officers. My mother was a police officer, about 30 years service. My father was about 45 years service. And they were both high-ranking police officers, and I had never seen them show reverence to anybody, but I always saw people show reverence to them. So my father was always saluted, my father was always having persons bowing, and I remember only one time seeing my father bow for someone. It was a judge. And I went home and I asked my mom, if I become a judge, would you all bow for me? And my mom said, well, I mean, technically, yes, if I saw you in public, I would bow or salute you. But then if you come home, I think you wash dishes. So I said, all right, well then bet. So I become a judge. That was the 7-year-old in me who wanted to have his mother and father salute him or bow for him. Between 7 and 16, I never really found anything else I had more of a passion for. So when I left our community college in St. Lucia, I came to Barbados to study law. Shortly after starting the program here, I came to realize I really didn't like law. That's fine to admit at this stage. I was good at it. I just didn't really have much of a passion for it. As far as I knew, Joe Public wanted to see a certain kind of bravado in the courtroom. That I could have done, but I didn't understand why I had to memorize law and legal systems. And I mean, I had the benefit of Professor Cordellini, great lecturer. I didn't know I had to memorize his book. So I called my mother after the first year, which cost us about $40,000 Australian dollars. Yeah, that's what, we said we should be paid to be here. And I said to her, I don't want to do this anymore. She laughed and said, good joke. So I had second year and third year to continue. I graduated here, went on to Ewing Law School in Trinidad, which I actually enjoyed. Ewing is fun. Not just for the carnival and the vibes. Ewing actually is a fun school to be at. Yeah, so those who are going to Norman Manley, you go to a good law school as well, you will however be beaten by Ewing Law School. We just beat you all every year. Every year. So, went on to the Ewing Law School, where I was, by the way, I was the PRO of the Law Society here. Went on to Ewing Law School, became the mooting chairperson, which is why I can speak to our prowess at beating Norman Manley every year. So then I graduated from the Ewing Law School. Luckily, and I would advise most of you to take this path, from my first summer at the University of West Indies, when I went back home, I met up with an attorney, and I started spending every Christmas and summer at that office. So from my first summer, I was introduced to the judge, and during trials of my, now senior, requested permission for me to sit at the bar table, even though I was not called. So during all of the trials, during all of his motions, all of his matters, I sat right there at the bar table, just absorbing everything. By the time I was called, I knew how to impanel a jury, I knew my way around the courthouse, all the judges knew me, All of the clerks knew me because I was now 5 years in this, as opposed to the other people who were just being called and now trying to find how things work within the courtroom space. Everything they teach you at the University of the West Indies is theoretical and it won't help you in practice. Be kind. If you don't know where the company's registry is, how to file that document, which you're not going to learn here, how to get something out quickly, how to tweak something or change something, then your initial few years in practice is going to be rough and it's going to be slightly poor. Mine wasn't. It's a new, but it was about how the system ran. So I became a junior partner in my chambers 3 years ago. I also heard that my head of chambers was a minister in government and decided to leave the office, so I was able to be venerated to become junior partner in a relatively short space of time. I realized very early on that there was no retirement plan for attorneys. So, in the solution context, you got a client today and they paid you a retainer of $15,000, $20,000. That seems like a lot of money from one client, so you're doing well. But then you realize that that matter will probably drag on for 6 or 7 years based on adjournments and other issues. So even if you're getting a refresher on your fees, it really pales in comparison to the cost of running chambers. So if I get that $15,000 from 2 clients during the course of that month, I've now made $30,000. It seems like you made a lot of money, but then you're paying your rent, you're paying your other overheads, you're paying your staff, and you're spending $25,000 just on operational costs. And that matter is going to take you 10 years to complete. So I did the math very early and I realized that means I need to make another $30,000, $40,000 next month just to stay open for that month. And then another $30,000 the following month so I can finish the case that's going to take me 10 years to do. So I'm going to do this every day for the next 10 years. So when I'm ready to retire, I have cases that will be still 10 years down the line. What led me to realize that was one of my first cases I completed. So it was myself and 2, at the time, Queen's counsels in a matter. And when we completed the matter by way of negotiation, we were able to finalize this is what we're doing. So we had a consent order filed. And I said to the judge, it brought me great pleasure to finish this case because the case was filed on the 20th of October 1987. I completed that matter in 2012. The 20th of October 1987 was the day before I was born. So I sat in the court. When they filed that case, my mother was in hospital about to give birth to me. An attorney received a retainer for that matter before I was born. And they were still, and now we're still fighting that matter. And I was there helping them bring it to finality. So I can't do this. So in 2015, the courts had closed for 9 months in St. Lucia because we had a major mold issue within the courts. So I took that opportunity for me to venture outside of St. Lucia and decided to move to Canada. I had a then girlfriend who lived in Canada, who was babyless at the time, who convinced me that it was a great idea to move to Canada. The weather is great, everything's lovely, it's not -40 for about a quarter of the year. So I said to my senior, I'm going to move to Canada for a while. The courts have been closed now for about 4 or 5 months. I think this is the best time for me to see what else the world has to offer. So I went up to Canada, spent a few months, started looking into consultancies up there. I then got an opportunity for me to go into management. Again, I had been on boards for credit unions and been engaged in the credit union sector in St. Lucia for quite some time. So I took the opportunity to go back to St. Lucia to become a project manager for a credit union, and I managed one for a year. That was my first time outside of legal practice earning a regular wage. And it was fun. So practice having not been as fun for me. Studying law having not been as fun for me. I had my first fun experience as a manager of a credit union. I thought, all right, maybe there's something beyond legal practice out there for me. That's why. But I think everyone can hear me. Yeah. So, very better now. Very well. So, anyway, so having managed that credit union for about a year, I was offered the position full time and asked if I would stay on as a credit union manager. As much as I had fun during that year, I didn't think that was my goal. So I turned down that contract and I returned to the minus 40 degrees in Canada for a couple of years. We did a lot of traveling. I burned a lot of money out of my savings for the world. And then the Attorney General of St. Lucia called my mother one day. True story. I was sitting down on our couch in Toronto and the Attorney General called my mother and said, "Where is Dylan?" Well, he's right next to me. Is he ready to come home to get national service? I see him just traveling the world. I was asked to come back to St. Lucia to serve as a legal consultant for the Ministry of Commerce. I came down, I was interviewed, I was hired as the legal officer at the Ministry of Commerce to advise on a specific piece of legislation that was 20 years in the making. It was our Consumer Protection Act. It had not been passed, and my task was to bring that to finality, finish this act. All right, so it took me about 2 years, I finished that. But while I was working on the Consumer Protection Act, St. Lucia decided I wanted to legalize cannabis. This is where it starts to get interesting. I see everybody starting to smile. Cannabis. So my permanent secretary asked me if I was interested in serving on a task force to review the cannabis status in St. Lucia and develop legislation for cannabis. That seemed fun. And again, I'm always chasing something that's exciting. So I'm a rolling stone. If it's not interesting to me, it doesn't give me reason to get up in the morning, I'm not going to go. So I served on that task force for 2 years. From there was an election, there was a commission to be created. I was asked to serve on that commission. And we developed a bill for cannabis. Then we decided to make it broader and we could deal with all the substances that has to be regulated. Because there was an attorney on the commission and we realized our explosive legislation in St. Lucia was from 1899. Our petroleum legislation was from about 1960. Alcohol was from about 1994. So lots of the other substances that ought to be regulated had inadequate legislative provisions. So some savvy attorney said to the then permanent secretary and minister, instead of just cannabis, you should regulate a number of substances. Developed the cabinet memorandum, requested permission to do it. It was agreed. So they're going to develop an entire new statutory body for cannabis and other regulated substances. That seemed fun. But I was an attorney. Right now I was back in St. Lucia, so I was an attorney, so I figured out this was something that I had to do within the context of being a corporate secretary, something legal. I applied for the position of corporate secretary for the Regulated Substances Authority. And right before the applications for that position closed, I was advised by someone that I should apply for the CEO position. I never saw myself in the capacity of CEO because, again, I'm thinking I'm a lawyer. And what lawyers would do would be the corporate secretary, general counsel, legal advisor. That's pretty much my scope. That's all I had done with the short stint, with the exception of the short stint of the credit union. That's really all I had done. I'd been a consultant, I'd been a legal advisor, I'd been a corporate secretary, I'd been the secretary on boards. But I took a person's advice and I applied for the CEO position. And I guess they called my bluff. So having served as an attorney and said that this entity was possible, that it could work, that they could allow for the legalization of cannabis, that they could review the legislation around explosives, they could review legislation around alcohol, they could set up a nice umbrella organization to run all of these substances. You then had a board that said, well, if you think it's possible, and you're the one drafting all of that, well, then you come and do it. So I became the CEO of the Regulated Substances Authority of St. Lucia in December 2024. So I've now been there for a little over a year. We have since completed the legislation for cannabis in St. Lucia. It's a little bit easier when you understand how to draft legislation. We've completed the regulations that support the legislation. Again, it's a little bit easier when you understand how regulations work. Developing the guidelines to support the legislative regime. Again, it's a little easier when you have that context in mind. We have also developed legislation to allow for an amnesty for cannabis cultivators, current cannabis cultivators, which is a little bit easier when you're an attorney, you understand how an amnesty works and the provisions of the Minister of Justice and the Governor General and how all of these processes flow. So I've been able to utilize my schooling in law to pivot into the regulation of cannabis. I didn't get my father to salute me because I never became a judge. However, my father, having served as the head of the drug squad and narcotics division in St. Lucia for about 10 years, and having burnt down the most cannabis in St. Lucia, I still have the satisfaction of knowing that he burnt down the most farms and I'm the one legalizing letting people smoke cannabis in St. Lucia. I still got a little bit of a kick out of it. So that's my story, at least from university up to where I stand today. I'm actually in Barbados for a meeting of the Caribbean Cannabis Forum to discuss testing for cannabis and geographic indicators. Again, my appreciation of geographic indicators comes from my understanding of intellectual property law. So I've been able to advise my colleagues throughout the region, who are the other CEOs for the authorities in Barbados, in Antigua, in Jamaica, in St. Vincent, to say, well, we should look into intellectual property rights for our cannabis in the region, maybe set up a niche product that we can derive more revenue from. But again, that comes from my understanding of the law. So everything that you learn, including Professor Henry Bell's Antoine's book and Professor Podlini's book and all of these books that may seem like there is no application, I tend to think there's greater application for all of that knowledge outside of the legal framework. That's my honest. So, becoming a director within a statutory body, you are in a better position because you understand governance and you understand legal frameworks. Discussing, for example, how the legislation works puts you in a better position because you are an attorney, even though you don't serve as a corporate secretary. So don't limit how you see your tutelage taking place within this context that I have to be an attorney. Very few persons are really limited to that. In my case, I became the CEO of the RSA because I dared to say that something like that was possible. So I created my table. Many times I say to persons, if you're not getting a seat at the table, then just build your own. So within the legal space, you have King's counsels and a number of seniors who are going to say to you that you need to fight for a space at that table. Being honest is really just crumbs left. That's the reality. When I came to campus, I recognized that. The real money doesn't come from the person whose mother's selling at a market and does some criminal activity and she's going to come to pay you with 5s and 10s. That's not going to keep your chambers afloat. The real money comes from usually corporate clients who have the pockets to be able to pay for you because they realize the value of the work that you put in. And they will pay that not just for the attorney, but they will pay that for other persons who have skill sets that they see. So, when you're doing company law, don't see yourself as becoming a company's lawyer. See yourself as becoming any other person within the company. Understand what the attorney also has to do. So when my corporate secretary has an issue, she can come to me and we can both have a conversation. Because that is how dynamic the law is. So whereas with some of the other disciplines, they're a lot more focused within sociology and how society works. Law is really just reading and understanding. That really is what law is. If you can read and you can understand how something works, you're ready for it to get into any field. Outside of medicine, you're ready. So don't just say, I read the book and I can do surgery tomorrow. That's a little bit different. But my advice to you is, if you want to be an attorney, then there's space at school. But if you see yourself in any other capacity, it is available to you. I'm testament to that. There's tons of consultancies that are available to persons. There's tons of grants available to persons for lots of projects. You can go on the CARICOM website, the ACS website, and see persons asking for assistance from consultants for tons of programs. And you would be surprised to find out that something that you may have done as an elective, something that you may have had some experience in because you worked in that sphere for a while, may open you up to these consultancies, and your legal background makes you more attractive because of it. So again, law is just a tip of the iceberg, but law will open lots of doors. The door you decide to walk through really depends on what you have an interest in, and you can never stop evolving. After the RSA, there will be somewhere else I will find myself that will be more fun to me. And when that's done after 5 or 6 years, I can guarantee you there will be somewhere else I will find me. Probably not cutting up somebody medical field, but short of that, I'm pretty sure I'll find myself somewhere else. So I've now spoken for 1.5 hours. I did not bring cannabis samples. Let's just get that sorted. I do, however, have the benefit of my dear friends and colleagues from the Barbados Medicinal Cannabis Authority. There are two of the CEOs somewhere around, so that's my friend. There's, I think inside there's a little fridges moving up outside. So, any questions, concerns, queries? Where we started, how it started, where it is, where it's going.
Got any questions?
So the legal profession is one of the safest to do. If I want right now, I can get a desk. I don't even need a desk. I can take a sheet of plywood, put it on my lap, step outside, go all the way somewhere, and I can make $10, $20. There's always the opportunity you have in you. If you have a seal and you have your practicing certificate, if you're going to Bridgetown right now, you may not get $5,000 today, but you can make some money. So it really is what are you willing to bet on yourself? Because nobody can take away from you your legal education. And as long as you are staying on the straight and narrow, and you've not been disbarred for any reason, so you can have that practicing certificate and you have that seal, there's nothing that stops you from taking the risk. Because you can always go back into practice. You may not have the fancy office when you start off. You may have to build back up to that. But you always have the opportunity because you need to do it.
You said that you would have worked on regulations on substances and legalizing certain substances, etc. Which country in the region do you think put up the most resistance to that type of work, as well as which one was the, I want to say the best, but the easiest to work with, so to speak, because I know cultures differ largely across the regions of the streets.
You speaking specifically to the cannabis?
Yes.
Every country handles cannabis differently. Every single country. So Jamaica was the first, and every opportunity I get, I applaud them for it. No, it has to be said. Everybody was afraid of what would happen if, when the Caribbean islands was to decriminalize and legalize cannabis. And Jamaica said, hold my bear. So, I mean, we didn't get it right, but where we are as a region, nobody so far has got it right. But where we are as a region is because Jamaica was able to shoot from the hip and just said, people try it. Because if we don't try something, it's not going to happen. St. Vincent was able to do so because Jamaica did. So St. Vincent realized that the world didn't end when Jamaica passed law to allow for it. So St. Vincent decided they could do it. And then you have jurisdictions like Barbados, which is a very conservative state, that went, well, if Jamaica could do it, and St. Vincent could do it, then we could do it, Antigua's doing it, St. Lucia's doing it. So that's why I always take the opportunity to thank Jamaica, because had they not done it, we may still be in the same space saying it probably would work. we're looking at the context. Everybody had to do it for what was within their own social group. So Barbados has legislation that's very different to what St. Lucia is proposing, but it was couched in such a way that it was supposed to satisfy the Barbadian populace and the administrations in these various countries. St. Vincent is very different. What we've developed in St. Lucia is very different. Antigua is also very different. So we would have, during the process of developing our legislation and our regulations, we looked at Antigua, we looked at St. Vincent, we looked at Barbados, we looked at Jamaica, and we said, that gal in St. Lucia. So in the case of St. Vincent, everything requires a prescription. As long as it's cannabis related, it requires a prescription. Barbados is similar. Everything requires a prescription. When we visited St. Vincent, and that is why I say to you, you have to look at beyond just strictly black and white in law. I asked the CEO there, how much is a visit to a doctor in St. Vincent? And he said to me it was about $60. I said, all right. Well, a general practitioner in St. Lucia is about $150 to $200. That is just for a general practitioner. That's not a specialist. So if an old lady has to go to a doctor once a month or once every 2 months to get a cream for her knees, and she's paying that doctor $150 to $200, that's not going to do it for my industry. But in St. Vincent it can do, because it's $60. So we had to say that in the St. Lucian context, we needed to separate things and allow for there to be access to a certain cannabis product or a certain potency of cannabis product that would not require a doctor's prescription. But all of the other islands said to us, well, that's not possible. You have to go by that route. So we are okay. Took some time, and in the case of St. Lucia, that's why we have what we call Class 1 and Class 2 cannabis. So Class 1 doesn't require prescription. Class 2 does. All of the attorneys would have said to me, so we'll just put all that in our legislation, and it sounded like it made sense. But Jamaica has made a grave error in everything in their legislation. And having worked outside of legal field, I realized sometimes you want some wiggle room. So our legislation just says Class 1, Class 2, and the potency for Class 1, Class 2 shall be prescribed. So Class 1, Class 2 is in our regulations. So we have a committee called the Medicinal Cannabis Advisory Committee. We advise the minister, and the minister will say X potency flower will be Class 1, above that will be Class 2. So it gives us the ability to pivot and move depending on what society is accepting of. So we may have to start very low, and as we become more accepting, we can change that Class 1 potency to a higher one, or if we realize it is too strong, scale back and make it into a lower potency. So we have seen that very different, and even today in our conversations on testing, we recognize that there's some benefit in tweaking a few things in our regulations. So as much as St. Lucia is late to the party, and I always make this joke, we like to think of ourselves as being the best dressed for the party. So, and you will see countries like Grenada that are coming on board next, and Dominican coming on board next, who will have more refined regimes because they have the opportunity to see what everyone else has done, what has not worked, and also look at their own social context and see what will work for them. With respect to cannabis sector in Belize. So yeah, we started all the way in Thailand and went straight across to Uruguay. So we looked at, including Canada, we looked at every single jurisdiction. And even in some contexts, we felt that there was a need for us to take a few things. So we actually borrowed from Canada in certain respects. Our whole Class 1, Class 2 system is actually borrowed from the Canadian model of the recreational and the prescription based. So we looked at Belize, we looked at even Trinidad and what they had done at the time, because Trinidad by that time had allowed for 4 meal plants, I think it was at the time. That was during Keith Rowley was Prime Minister at the time. And he allowed for 4 meal plants. And we sat down and nobody wants meal plants. But in the Trinidadian context, they had allowed you to cultivate 4 meal plants. How many of you can look at a cannabis seed and tell if it's a male or female or hermaphrodite? How are you planting 4 meal plants? So when we saw the legislation, we went, all right, cool. They don't want to have people have high THC flower. So they're trying to find some wise way of working at it. But the male plant point was ridiculous to us. So we just decided a lot of people could make 4 plants. That's non-commercial. You can't sell it, but it's for your own personal use and consumption. So that's how we did it. But every island is trying. And nobody's gotten it perfect yet. And I don't think we will anytime soon.
Can I ask I've always heard people who plant cannabis commercially talk about how, at least in the context of Jamaica, that they say that fees and so kind of restricts like small farmers and so from trying to get involved in trying to sell commercially. So I'm curious to ask, I guess, what has St. Lucia and probably some of the other countries in the region done to address those concerns that the fees and so that going to licensing would block small farmers from being involved?
That's a very politically sensitive topic. I somehow knew that this outside the courtroom talk would end up in a cannabis farm. So it is true that in most cases, throughout most of the jurisdictions, they see the licensing regime as being very onerous. But that has to be balanced with the responsibilities of these authorities within the cannabis space. So it's not cheap to actually regulate the cannabis space. We have implemented, similar to Barbados, traceability platforms that can track it from seed to sale and these things in our context in St. Lucia. The fee for just these platforms easily will run you $500,000, $750,000. Somebody has to pay for it. So when the authority that is supposed to be revenue generating, because we can't just take the government's money and say that we want cannabis to be allowed, and the authority has now overheads that easily go into the millions, somebody has to pay for it. So you can't expect a prime minister in their wisdom to say, well, the hospital needs an x-ray machine, and we have a need for this within the social context, but the cannabis authority wants $5 million for them to be able to give people. It doesn't make sense. So there has to be recognition that as much as we want to support the what we call traditional cultivators in our space, somebody has to be able to pay for the platforms that allow for the industry to be viable and allow us internationally to keep the industry running. So in our context, if I want to export cannabis to Barbados, it's not as easy as just saying, Shanika, can I send you some weed? So I'm giving an exporter a license to do so. She has to give an importer a license to do so. We have to arrange what the quantity of that cannabis going is. Then inform INCB all the way in Geneva that, okay, we're going to be doing an exchange of cannabis between this country and that country. It's that amount. They're going to say, what is Barbados' quota for import? Because every country has a quota that they can import. What is St. Lucia's quota for export? Have either of them passed their quotas? All right, cool. That can then be transferred from this country to that country. That is how that shipment takes place. Somebody has to pay for all of that bureaucracy. We don't want that bureaucracy. As I would have said in a podcast about a week ago, you have an Amazon account, right? And you have a Visa card that you use for that Amazon account. Because, I mean, we like to buy nice things. So if we do not follow with the platforms that the INCB requires and the reporting that the INCB requires, then we have a challenge with the INCB. And you have the INCB then saying to certain banks, these people have money that is falling afoul of anti-money laundering provisions, of anti-terrorist financing provisions. So I don't think you should allow for that money to come through the US, for Canada, for Europe, and all of a sudden your visa card number. And then you will call Mrs. Roberts Odell and say, but I like to order nice things on Amazon. The reality is, if she's going to allow for you to keep that beautiful little visa card, she has to put in place these parameters. And that infrastructure, as I said, is not cheap. So somebody else.
So bringing back to outside of the courtroom.
And not in the field.
Right. Usually, as a lawyer, when you move outside of the legal field, we tend to become advisors to decision makers, usually CEOs or someone in a managerial position. But for yourself as CEO now and having been the manager of the credit union for a year, what is that learning process like to become a competent decision maker after being an advisor?
So my first day operating a credit union, I walked into the financial controller's office to ask some questions because, you're trying to understand things. And I asked him what our financial position was. I won't say the answer that he gave me, but after receiving the response, I went into the manager's office and sat down there in the darkness for about 3 hours. I'm pretty sure I was very close to a stroke. The position was not good at the time. And I remember thinking, I'm screwed. I should have just stayed there and bettered my mortgages and done my thing. Fine. Now I hear this is the situation. I don't know how to deal with that. I don't know how to go and fix this financial situation. But when I also lecture at the community college back home, I usually teach people that it's important to go through the processes for decision making. So it is not something that is only limited to a law student. The CEOs, and I can speak for myself now and for other CEOs, the decision making process is the same regardless as to how we've been schooled in law, in sociology, in chemistry. You're going through the same process to make a decision. And when you make a decision, you have to be firm enough in the fact that you know you went through the proper process to get there. I took all the information into account. I looked in the background of everything. I looked at the spillover from all my decisions. I made sure that I could deal with the repercussions. I weighed all of these things. I know what is best for the entity. I balanced that against all of the other issues that are at play, and I've made this decision. And people will say to you, no matter what the decision is, that's wrong. There will always be people who say to you, you got it wrong. You have to then remember, I didn't just appear at this decision. That into consideration, that into consideration, that into consideration. What you're saying may be valid, and it doesn't mean I can't take that into consideration as well, but I know I've gone through the right process, and you have to have faith in yourself. So it's not just from the legal context, to anybody who has that responsibility of making decisions, and you will have some heavy decisions to make. That's the process that you go through.
I got another question, but it's back in the field.
Funny enough, we have a panel discussion next week in St. Michael diving into the weeds. So I feel like this is the precursor to that. So I'll let you dive back into the weeds.
So I am from Antigua, and for a very long time I've been interested in the science of cannabis and now related to law, the decriminalization of it. And I noticed that you would have said none of the countries have gotten it right, and I feel like I witnessed that last summer. We were in a hearing for this guy who works on a cannabis farm, and the farm had a license and everything. But he was transporting more than the 15 grams that were allowed to him. And he was charged because he was transporting marijuana that was legal to grow in point A, legal to sell in point B, but he was charged because he was transporting it. And the magistrate would have opined that he thinks that this is something the drafters need to revisit because clearly our act is not doing it correctly. Still charged him, but they were saying he doesn't agree with the decision, but he has to follow the law.
So in the context of Antigua, there is a transportation license. So in order to transport anything in excess of the amount that you're allowed to have for personal possession, you are required to have a license for transportation. So
the judge was saying that, but I'm not sure if he was informed or not, but he was saying that clearly there's a gap in the legislation and what's going on about the lack of licensing, such and such and such. And I never really followed up on it until this discussion here. So I'm wondering if gaps like that do exist, or it's tedious to get, or unfair financially to have to buy a purchasing license, a working license, a transport license, etc., etc. How do you find the balance for that in a field like this?
So I don't know of the intricate facts within that case, so I can't speak to it specifically, but I do know in our context in St. Lucia, there is a license for transportation. In most jurisdictions, there's a license for transportation. So before I go into the specifics of that, I'll give you some background on why it's important. And again, people outside the industry may not recognize what I just said to you earlier. We are putting the framework, as onerous as it may seem, it's being put in place for a reason. When you have a store in a mall that's selling any good, and let's say you have a lot of sales, at the end of the day, do you take that cash into your pocket, the $6,000, $7,000, $18,000, $100,000 you've made, and walk it across to the bank? Or do you call somebody to do cash in transit? Because of the value of the product, you do cash in transit. For those who know, and if you don't know, you should know, cannabis is a cash crop. So you see how before we made money for bananas and sugarcane, cannabis makes these things seem like nothing. The value of one sugarcane plant cannot compare to the value of what you would harvest off of a cannabis plant. So you can look at one plant that could be worth from $1,000 Eastern Caribbean to $5,000 US easily. If he's carrying a pound, you may say, but I mean, he's just carrying a pound. You know what that pound worth? So that is why it's a transportation license. So when it leaves the cultivator, it is in a secure space, so nobody's going to try to now access that because they recognize, just like the cash and transit vehicles are not being hit, that vehicle is not going to be compromised. So I do see the benefit of the transportation license and we included in our regime. Whether he was not aware of the transportation license, to my mind, is immaterial. Law says if you have one, that you're supposed to have a transportation license. Whether there's room for them to look at the transporting amounts. So in our case, for sacramental use, we allow for a certain amount of product to be moved if you're registered in that space, and you don't require a transportation license, because if the Rasta man saying we have some worship taking place in the tabernacle and I want to move from there to there and I need to move 2 pounds, that is something that our legislation looks at and says, we're not going to cause the congregation to transport 2 pounds by way of a licensed transporter. In that case, you can inform us, it will be on vehicle X, Y, and Z. It is a maximum of X pounds, not going up to the threshold required, and we have that. But again, that comes from us seeing what other people have done, recognizing that, yeah, that might be an issue, and trying to plug that down.
I can't speak for the guy who was transporting around, who was telling the truth, because anything to get innocent plea or whatever the case is, but I think he was saying that it was grown legally and he was taking it, because those farmers got a complimentary license because of stigmatization or whatever the case is, and he was taking it to like the church or something like that, but he was still charged because it was over the amount that he was allowed to have, which was 15 grams, and he was saying that I can't transport 15 grams back and forth, so I'm going to take 15 grams, go to the church, come back, it's another 15, and the judge was basically saying that he understands that, but according to the laws, he has to go to charge.
So, I mean, and these are great opportunities for revision of legislation. And that is why I would have said earlier, it's also great opportunities for us to not be as prescriptive in legislation. So when you're drafting, think about what really has to be in the law. In the case of Jamaica, the fee for licenses in the legislation. If you want to change the fee tomorrow, you have to go back to Parliament to change the fee. So it may be wise to look at having these things in your regulations, and you can, by way of a decision of your minister, issue regulations to change things. So again, maybe Antigua could look into that, but they have somebody like you that has an interest. So we can put you in contact with the CEO of it. You can have a conversation with him and say to him, if your legal background and your expertise and interest in cannabis, that's what you should do. Any other cannabis or non-cannabis questions?
Well, it was quite interesting to hear that in Antigua it is 50 grams, you said? I think it's significantly more in St. Vincent and Grenadine.
56.
Yes, it is 56. And so it was actually quite crazy. 15. But my actual question is, what are the biggest challenges you face as somebody who has to make those regulations, etc., make those decisions? Like, what are the biggest challenges that you face? Specifically balancing between laws and what it used to be, as well as this new integration of social acceptance.
In my current office, the biggest challenge you face is the politics. So when you're an attorney, you are only worried about your client's best interest. You don't have to necessarily balance, well, what is society going to think, what is this, what is that. I have sworn to do right by my client, they have paid me, and I'm going to represent them to the best of my ability. If I cannot, then I'm going to have to recuse myself and say I cannot represent this client to the best of my ability. To my mind, it makes it much easier. When you are in a space like I am, and like a lot of the other regulatory authorities are, you find yourself saying, I need to regulate and do what is best for the industry. But at the same time, I need to see what's best for the players in the industry that I'm regulating. and recognize that, okay, so this is probably what's best from a regulatory standpoint, but that is way too onerous for you. How can I work with you? Because I need you to be a viable business for me to even exist. So that for me has been one of the greater challenges, determining the politics of it. How do I keep you afloat so that I can police you? Because if you're not going to stay afloat, there's no industry. So that for me has been the biggest challenge. We're always on a nice edge. And a lot of people don't realize, not even within the cannabis space only, but generally, we find ourselves on a nice edge every day making decisions that nobody even realizes. We're sitting down there saying, all right, 15 in the case of Antigua, Barbados is 14 or 15? Barbados is 14. St. Vincent is 56, Jamaica is 56. St. Lucia is sitting in the middle at 30. And we are presenting to our minister saying, are we good at 30? We want to move to 56? Should we go down to... That's a conversation. Now, everybody who is consuming cannabis is saying 56. Nobody's going to say, I want to have less in my pocket. They all want the 56. So you now have to say to a minister who's also going to try to satisfy these persons and give them 56, why we should probably not look at 56. This is probably what's better for us. There's going to be more chances of this risk and that risk if we do 56. So it's the politics of it that makes the decisions difficult. Don't even do too bad about cannabis. Only half of the questions were cannabis. Which is good. I got a question about, being in the credit union. I got one or two other questions. So I don't feel too Mr. Weed.
It's been a while since I've read the bill again, all 150-some pages of it. But to my recollection, our proposed bill is a bit more, as I've been told, comprehensive than a few of the others that currently exist. Can you say what it is that you guys recognize was missing as it relates to us, and why the decision was made to include those things or tweak what you do?
I wouldn't say that the other islands have things missing. I would say that when we were developing our regime, we had more time and we took specific consideration on some of the matters that we wanted to address in our context. So the class 1, class 2, for example, is something that only we have thus far. And I would not be surprised if when we need it passes their legislation, you see something similar. When we first suggested class 1, class 2, we were told by our counterparts in St. Vincent that it can't be done. We can't allow for it. But our legislation has easily another 30 pages that deal with class 1 cannabis and how you address that. We also expanded how you deal with the traditional cultivators. We saw that in the context of St. Vincent, we really liked it. So we added that on. That doesn't exist in all of the jurisdictions, but we have a whole thing on legacy operators, as we call them. So unlike in St. Vincent, where you can see, I used to sell cannabis, or I used to cultivate cannabis. So I want to come in as a traditional cultivator. In our legislation, we say, I used to be involved in cannabis, so I'm a legacy operator. And so it allows you to come into the industry as a dispensary as well. In the case of St. Vincent, it lets you come in fully as a cultivator. So we added that additional step saying, well, maybe you were a cultivator in the hills somewhere in land in own. You're not going to be able to continue to cultivate in that space. You don't have access to land. Maybe you don't have family land or land you own. Becoming a cultivator will be challenging for you. But you will still involved in the industry. You're not going to be able to apply for a license as a traditional cultivator, but we will still recognize you as a legacy operator. And in that way, you can then come into being a dispensary. Because you were involved in the industry, we want to keep you in the industry. So we expanded a number of things that we saw in some of the other islands, and that's why you'd see easily another 10 pieces on that, that made our bill a little bigger.
When I read through, it reminded me a lot because, as you know, I live in Canada, so when the NSLC and LCBO started to dispense cannabis, I recognized a lot of similarities in the way of the operation, per se. Like I think in Canada, for example, on the first day of the came in, we were all registered doctor, you are registered. You have to be registered to verify your age limits, your health before you could be allowed to access the dispensary and then buy. And then even as you were to, if you were to order it for delivery, it had to be for a specific company, a specific amount, and then you had to display all of that information. So they really need to like recognize it.
So in the case of Canada, they really started with a high threshold for their security platform on cannabis specifically. I remember when the cultivation started there, you had to have 2 rows of fencing. There was supposed to have the dogs in between the 2 rows, and you had what's called a soft touch fence. You know, anybody knows what a soft touch fence is? Soft touch fence means if you touch it, it can sense it's been touched, and the police would be alerted immediately, and they would get there within a certain space of time. So in the farms in Canada, when they first passed the legislation, if you just walk outside of a cannabis farm and you touch the fence, police would come there within 10 minutes. That's where they started. You can go to farms in Canada right now and see 1 row of fence. They've removed the soft touch, they've removed the roaming dogs, they've removed all of that because they started an industry, they set the threshold high, everybody realized, I can't really form a food with this. These people are serious. And as you've weeded out the possible nefarious actors and the people who may want to take advantage of loopholes and abuse the industry, these people have now come out of the industry and now say, I can relax things some more. So in our social context in St. Lucia, when I speak to the staff, they always say, we're starting low and we're moving slow. It's a military term where if you're trying to get to the end of a battlefield, and trust me when I say, legalizing cannabis for many of us has been like a battle. When we are getting all the blowback from the public, why we don't do this, why we don't do that, we are fighting a battle on another end that we are not aware of. So what in most cases we have sought to do is start low and just keep moving slow.
Okay, in the Caribbean, we know that regardless of your age, well, at least in Jamaica, a lot of young people start doing drugs and alcohol at early ages. So my question to you is, when drafting the bill for St. Lucia, did you consider like an age limit for consumption of weed per se?
So yes and no. We did consider an age limit for class 1 cannabis. So class 1 cannabis, you remember, is the cannabis that doesn't require prescription. You can walk in and you can purchase from a class 1 dispensary if you are over the age of 21. Don't kill me. You must be 21 years and over to be able to go into a class 1 dispensary and acquire class 1 cannabis. Because in that case, you are self-prescribing and self-medicating. We had sufficient pushback from the medical fraternity that said they wanted to be 25 and we moved it from the 18 age up to 21. And that's why it requires 21 age limit to get into those dispensaries. However, it is a medicinal cannabis industry. So if you are 12, if you are 4, but you can benefit from a cannabis product, a doctor can prescribe a child of any age through their caretaker, their parent, a cannabis product to use for their benefit for a qualifying purpose. So that's why I say yes and no. If you're self-prescribing a class 1 product, 21. If the child can benefit, they have epilepsy, they have anything else, they benefit from a cannabis-derived product, at any age the parent goes and says, my child has this issue, they can't get that prescribed to them, whether it be class 1 or class 2.
So my next question is piggybacking on what you said again, right? I'm trying to make sure I formulate this properly.
I feel like Shanika has to come here to give a cannabis lecture.
It seems so.
Yeah. I think there's a need for...
I actually thinking that that's what
But
Go ahead.
essentially, the question is, in terms of recreational cannabis, I know within the context of simulated and credits, you are limited to your private homes and certain religious settings. However, the question is still asked, what is being done to that realm. Because in St. Vincent, you can actually, there, well, from my experience, you can just walk in without a license, without a prescription, without any form of documentation, without any form of knowing your age or anything, and purchase.
I'm so happy the camera is pointing at me and not you. Yeah. No, I'm not just saying, we're breaking all the laws and saying, we just walk in, we just do it as we please.
Well, that's why I said through my experience, but I'm fine. Not me.
Speak on behalf of a friend.
You're not putting on.
Asking for a friend.
I clear myself from all liability. But in terms of that, in terms of recreational use, what are your views of that? And has there been any movements or at least conversations in terms of recreational use?
A lot of countries have in the Caribbean discussed and shown appetite for recreational cannabis. Before we even get into that, I think that a lot of the people that believe that they are recreationally using cannabis or not, they are actually medicinally using it, but they don't recognize it. So the persons who, at the end of a long day, use cannabis for them to relax, that's not recreation. If you feel anxious and at the end of the day you're like, bro, I had a really tough day, and that is you recognizing that within myself there is something I'm trying to remedy. Whether you are using the right strain or the proper cannabis for that issue is something completely different. But the fact is, my view, and I know a lot of the persons within the cannabis space have that same view, these people are not recreationally using cannabis. They just do not realize that that is medicinal use of cannabis. Now, are there persons who are using recreationally? Yes. But I believe the vast majority of the people who believe it's recreational cannabis use are actually using cannabis medicinally. So that's one. Two, the Caribbean, every single island has changed the legislative regime with regard to cannabis, has allowed for medicinal cannabis use. So St. Vincent allows for medicinal cannabis use. The platform for access to it, being as it is, I cannot speak to. Dr. Thompson, who is the CEO there, would not want me to go into the terms of use there. But I do know that the regime in St. Vincent is for medicinal cannabis use. Likewise, Antigua has a medicinal cannabis industry. That is what is permitted. I could spend quite some time and go down a rabbit hole to discuss why we have not looked into recreational cannabis use. But remember, I did speak a little bit earlier about your visa and your Amazon card that you want to clear out by the end of the day. It does tie into whether within your space, I'll come to the question, whether within your space you have a recreational industry and you are telling the banks to accept money from recreational cannabis use, or whether you're telling your banks that we have a medicinal cannabis industry where people are actually using it as medicine, they're going through doctors, it's being administered this way, and you're asking them as banks to take in revenue from that kind of a sector. So that ties into that rabbit hole that I don't want to go into right now.
So, from your experience, right, given that you would have assisted job, what were some aspects that you felt like was very important in city study that bill must have covered? Like, you know, they have the age limit, they have the transport aspect, the license, like what were some things that you feel like were like very important when drafting that bill? It had to cover.
Two provisions. The legacy operator that I spoke of earlier was one of the most important things for us. In most of the jurisdictions, people have lamented that the people who are part of the industry, who were ostracized from society, who went to jail and had their locks cut when they were trying to feed their families and pay their bills, etc., etc., etc. That subset of society was left with the fact that they did not have the financial resources or other resources to get into the industry. So for us, one of the most important things was to allow for a carve-out for these persons. And that's why we created the legacy operator and the amnesty. So we have an entirely different bill called Drugs Prevention of Misuse Cannabis Amnesty Bill. Yeah, you understand how the laws are foolishly made. But that bill allows for persons who are cultivating or operating within the cannabis space illegally to come forward and say, I was illegally involved in the cannabis trade. Hey, present. I'm going to let you know I was a cultivator. I was cultivating in this space at this amount of plants. And when they put in an application, they can be given an amnesty. You will not be arrested, you will not be charged for having done that. But we now know you're involved in the industry. We will recognize you as a legacy cannabis operator. And the price point for your licenses is going to be far different from what anybody else who's coming to this place will be charged. So that was one component of our industry, which we created by a separate piece of legislation that we were very proud of. We haven't released the prices for our licenses yet. We know that some of the prices will be seen as a little bit exorbitant, but we have that carve out to allow for the legacy operators to become more attractive. So I don't have land, as I said. I don't have the resources to put in cameras and fencing and all of these things. But because I'm a legacy operator, the investor coming into my country can then say, I'd rather work with you because you're only going to pay X for a license than to set up their own establishment and keep you out of the industry. So that was one. The second is something we call the central trading entity. So only St. Lucia has a CTE in our legislation, and it requires that we essentially have a hub for all of our cannabis. So all the cultivators sell to a CTE, and all the dispensaries buy from a CTE. All the processors buy from a CTE. We can only have a maximum of 2 CTEs on island, and the CTEs must have at least 30% ownership from St. Lucians and legacy operators. So remember, you would have gotten your legacy operator status from the amnesty. Let's say I'm not going to be able to stay in the industry anymore. Nobody wants to work with me. I don't have land. I don't have the resources. But you can buy shares in the CTE. Every single plant that is grown in St. Lucia must be sold to the CTE, or if you are a cultivator and processor and dispensary, you pay the CTE royalties for having cultivated in St. Lucia. So the CTE is making money off every single plant on island. And the CTE has ownership among the legacy operators. You can now say, I can't grow anymore because they want me to have a mother plant and clone plants and have certain standards and need to test and heavy metals and pesticides. I can't do this. But I own shares in the CTE. So when these foreigners come in and they invest in that big farm and they sell that cannabis, they have to pay the CTE and I get dividends because I own shares in the CTE. So these are the two components of our industry that's different from most of the other islands that we really pride ourselves on. And it is now after 7 when I had promised to leave here, so I'll take one final question.
I'm very interested in regulatory and law functioning. So what early experience and career move did you pursue to establish yourself regulating cannabis?
And you are from?
Jamaica.
You're from Jamaica. Lamentably, the CEO from Jamaica, who is in Barbados right now, is not in the room. She's part of the conversation that we're having with the counterparts of the Barbados Medicinal Cannabis Authority. But again, when you got your acceptance to the University of West Indies, what did that letter say? You remember? You're studying law, right? Remember what that letter said? You are accepted to read for a degree in law. It starts with reading. So when I go into lots of spaces and I stand and people say, we saw you do an expert on cannabis. I've done a lot of reading. So if you want to find yourself in the right space, you ask me to do what? Go back to the acceptance letter. It says to read. I'll never forget that. I got that letter right outside there from the then registrar, Mr. Crystal. And I walked in and I saw you're trying to read for a degree. Come on, I said read for a degree. So you want to just make sure that every time you get an opportunity for you to read, and we're in a society now where there's a lot of opportunities to read, there's a lot of information available. If you're ever put in the right room, you need to have that information that you can see the person. I know about this, I know about that. That's how you will open doors. Read. Right? So let me thank you, one and all, for coming out, for having the interest and appetite in what I do outside the courtroom. Anytime I'm in Barbados, I'd be happy to come back to have a conversation with you guys. Those who are interested in cannabis, the Barbados Medicinal Cannabis Authority is right here and always willing to have conversations on cannabis use in Barbados. You can find their website, emcla.bb, to get more information on that. In St. Lucia, rsa.govt.lc for more information on our legislation and our path to legalization. Educate yourselves, don't learn other people's story, learn yours. And if you have somewhere outside the courtroom that you want to be in the next 20 and 30 years, draft that now and work back from there. You'll see the path. All right? Thank you again.
Good evening again, everyone. On behalf of the University of the West Indies Clinical Campus, I would like to sincerely thank our speaker for this evening, Mr. Dylan Norman Inglis, for an impactful and thought-provoking presentation. Your message truly resonated with everyone this evening. You reminded us to not be afraid to pivot, to embrace change, and to explore the many capacities available within and beyond the courtroom space. Your journey is a powerful example that adaptability is not weakness, but strength, that thriving in the legal profession requires courage and openness to grow. To all the students and attendees present this evening, thank you for showing up, thank you for engaging, and investing in your growth. Your presence is what makes events like these memorable and impactful. Mr. Inglis, once again, we thank you for pouring